Hello everyone, and welcome to the exercise on functions. Here are the instructions for this exercise. First, define a function that accepts two parameters, lower and upper. The parameters lower and upper are integers, and they must be lower first and then upper. So if the parameters are entered in the reverse order, we must have some condition to make sure that the lower parameter is first and the upper parameter is last. And then we'll prompt the user to enter integers between the two parameters, lower and upper. And if the user does not enter integers or integer between the lower and upper parameters, we have to prompt the user to enter integer again and display some kind of message. And finally, once the user enters an appropriate integer, we'll display that integer. So basically we'll have a function that accepts two parameters, okay, lower and upper, and those parameters are integers. So let's say 3 and 10. And if those are passed in the reverse order, let's say 10 and 3, we must have some kind of condition to reverse this. And basically the user has to enter an integer between those two parameters. And in this case, if the user enters, let's say 22 is not in this range. So we have to display a message saying, please enter an integer between 3 and 10 or something like that. And finally, when the user enters the appropriate integer, let's say 5, we'll display the integer that the user enters. Okay? Take a few moments to try this exercise. Great. Now let's see the exercise together. Okay, let's define our function. Let's start by defining our function. So we'll define, and then I'll name it. You can name it whatever you want. I'll just name it display integer. And then it accepts two parameters, lower and upper. And finally, what my function will do is display the result. So our function will return the integer input. Let's name it integer input from the user. That's the main purpose of the function. When the user finally enters an appropriate integer, which we will name integer input, we'll display that integer input variable. We'll return it. Okay? So let's start our function. So the first direction here is the parameters lower and upper are integer and must be lower first and then upper. Okay. In this case, let's have an if statement that will make sure that the smaller integer that we enter is the first parameter and the higher integer will be the second parameter, which is upper. So we can add an if statement, and simply we can say if let's say lower is greater than upper, we can say lower and then upper is equal to upper and lower. So what this basically means is if lower is greater than upper, make the lower upper and make the upper lower. That's what this if condition does. This does. Okay? And then let's prompt the user to enter an integer. We can say, and then whatever we prompt the user to enter, we'll save it in this variable, integer input. Let's do that. So integer underscore input, and that will be equal to raw input. If you are using Python 3, use the function input instead of raw underscore input. So we have raw input, and then let's see, enter an integer within the range. So we want the user to enter an integer between these two ranges, between lower and upper. So we'll say enter an integer within the range plus within the range lower plus and plus upper. Here this integer input is a string, so we'll have to make all of them string, otherwise we'll get an error because we cannot concatenate different data types. Here we have a string, so let's make everything string. So we'll convert our lower integer into a string, and similarly we'll do the same here. Upper will convert it into a string. Let's continue this in a new line. Okay, enter an integer. Okay, now that we have this, we'll cast everything into an integer. Okay, to do that, we'll put everything in parentheses and then cast it into an integer. That's because our raw input is a string. Our lower here is a string also, and our upper is a string, and we casted everything into an integer. That way the integer input will be converted into an integer. Next, what we will do is we'll take this integer input and then check if it's within this lower and then upper range. Let's do that. We can say while integer input is less than the lower limit, or while the integer input is greater than the upper limit, greater than the upper, we can print a statement and then prompt the user or tell the user that the integer they entered is not within this range. We can say print integer input is not between the upper, is not between the lower and upper. And then we'll prompt the user to enter an integer within the range lower and upper, and then we'll save that in our variable integer input. So integer input, and we'll set it to be equal to raw input. Again, if you are using Python 3, use the function input. So raw input, and then we'll say enter and enter an appropriate integer. Okay, we'll display that message to the user, and since this is a string, we'll cast it into an integer. So put everything in parentheses and then cast it into an integer. And finally, once the user enters an appropriate integer, we'll return the integer so that that integer will be displayed. Integer input. The reason why we're using while loop here is that if the user doesn't enter an appropriate integer, we'll keep displaying this message saying the integer you input is not between the lower and upper limit, and we'll again prompt the user to input an appropriate integer. And make sure your indentation is correct when using this while loop. Make sure this integer input that you prompt the user for the second time is at the same level as the print statement in your while statement, otherwise you'll run into an indefinite loop. Okay, if we use an if condition here, we'll only prompt the user once. That's why we're using the while statement. It will keep going back to that loop until the user finally enters an appropriate integer, and in that case the appropriate integer will be returned. Okay, now that we have our function, let's try it out. Okay, run it and then call our function display integer, and let's pass two parameters, let's say 5 and 16. Okay, run it. It says enter an integer within the range 5 and 16. Let's say 3. Run it. It says 3 is not between 5 and 16. Enter an appropriate integer. Let's say 4. 4 is not between 5 and 16. Enter an appropriate integer. Okay, the lower limit works. Let's put something outside of this upper limit. Let's say 18. Run it. It says 18 is not between 5 and 16. Enter an appropriate integer. Let's put 8. Run it. Okay, finally, once an appropriate integer is entered, it will be displayed. So finally we got 8. Here in our first statement here, enter an integer between 5 and 16, and then we input 3. So let me add a colon to this initial input statement. Okay, plus, let's add a colon or space. Okay, should be good now. Let's run it again. Let's call our function enter an integer between 5 and 16. Let's say 3. Run it. Okay, now it's good, right? And finally, when we enter an appropriate integer, it's displayed. Good. Again, as I mentioned, we're using while loop so that it goes to the loop back and then keeps asking the user to enter an appropriate integer. Let me show you what it would look like if we use if statement. So if we use if, so it will prompt the user to enter between 5 and 16, let's say 3, enter. So it prompts the user once. Now if I enter something out of range, it will not prompt me again. It will simply return that result. That's why we're using while loop. Okay, now that we saw our function, one thing we can do is we can add the main function. Okay, we can define our main function, and then we can call whatever we want to call in our main function. Let's call our function display integer, right? And then pass, let's say 5 and 16 as our lower and upper attributes. And let's call our function again, display integer, and in this case let's pass 30 and 7. Okay, once we pass that, we can call the main function and run it. It says enter an integer within the range 5 and 16. So first, once we call the main function is calling the display integer function 5 and 16. So it goes to our display integer function with lower and upper attributes of 5 and 16. That's what we have here. So enter an integer between 5 and 16. Let's say 99. 99 is not between 5 and 16. Let's say 1. 1 is not between 5 and 16. This time let's enter an appropriate integer. Let's say 8. So finally 8 is displayed. And then it goes to the next statement here within our main function. Display integer between 30 and 7. So in this case it says enter an integer within the range 7 and 30. So here we say that if the lower limit we entered is higher than or greater than the upper limit, so display by switching the position of those two attributes. So make the lower upper and make the upper lower. So we know that condition is working. We entered 30 as our lower limit and then 7 as our upper. But here we have the right range, 7 and 30. Okay, let's enter a number 4. 4 is not an appropriate one. Enter 5. 5 is not in the range. Let's say 34. It's not in the range. And finally, let's enter 20. So 20 is displayed. Okay. So by defining the main function, we can enter any statements that we want and simply call the main function. We could have also entered print before the execution of the display integer function between, let's say, 5 and 16, and then we can add another print statement here. The execution of the display integer function between 5 and 16 is completed. Then we can print some line breaks, let's say times 15, Let's add a couple of print statements before the execution of display function between 7 and 30. Okay, here in our main function, I added a couple of print statements before the execution of the display integer function between 5 and 16, and then we have our display integer function between these two ranges, 5 and 16, and then the execution of the function is completed, and we'll print a line. Then we have a similar print statement before the execution of our function between the integers 30 and 7, and then after the execution of that function, the statement will be printed. Then we have a line will be printed, and then we are ready for the third execution of our display integer function. So the importance of this main function is to put all the statements that are not included in our main function, in our function definition. And once we put all those statements in our main function, we can simply call the main function. And we don't have to enter all of this one by one. So once we call the main function, all we gotta do is run it. So before the execution of the display integer function between 5 and 16, it says enter an integer within the range 5 and 16. Let's say 3. 3 is not appropriate. Let's enter 8. Okay. And then, so the appropriate integer is displayed. And then we have the execution of the display integer function between 5 and 16 is completed. And then we are on the next display integer code here. So enter an integer within the range 7 and 30. Let's say 3. 3 is not appropriate. Let's enter 25. Okay. So 25 is displayed, and then we are on to the third range, which is before the execution of the display integer function between negative 15 and 25. Or let me change this to negative 15 and 25. And let's change this to times 18 times 18 times 18. Okay, let's run it again. Run it again. Our kernel is a little busy. Let's call our function again before the execution of the display integer. Okay, 3 enter. 3 is not between 5 and 16. Let's enter 12. Okay, the execution of the first statement is complete. Now between 7 and 30, let's say 4. 4 is not appropriate. Let's say 34. Enter an appropriate integer. Let's say 22. Okay, finally 22 is printed. And then execution of the next statement. Enter an integer within the range negative 15 and 25. Let's say negative 22, enter. Negative 22 is not between the range negative 15 and 25. Let's enter negative 7, enter. So the execution of the display statement, the display integer function between negative 15 and 25 is completed. It looks much neater, right? Great. So that's what I have for this exercise. Thank you everyone, and I'll see you at the next lecture.